going to do an introduction that I hope is worthy of Bob's writings. But Bob Podgurski has been doing poetry for over 25 years. And this is just a quote from Diane DePrima, not particularly about Bob, but it makes sense to me. The ultimate claustrophobia is the syllogism. The ultimate claustrophobia is it all adds up. Bob has had a lifelong pursuit examining Hermeticism, magic, alchemy, the Kabbalah, and Western esoteric studies. In one poem he writes, spheres of love react to that reaction. David Landry says, I've never been particular about reality. About Bob's book, Wandering on Course, Charles Stein says, magic cannot do without poetry, as poetry without magic dwindles to the sad reinforcement of consensual norms. That's a great quote. Podgurski, if any more should dance through me, I should burst at the seams. That's a great Podgurski line. Robert Duncan poem. Often I am permitted to return to a meadow, as if it were a given property of the mind, that certain bounds hold against chaos. That is a place of first permission, everlasting omen of what is. Robert Podgurski is a magus, and these poems cast spells. This is not a metaphor, it's a warning, says Peter Lamborn Wilson. A Podgurski quote. Then the reason our palms naturally face away, to grasp our fortunes we may not know, hopefully conceals them to make touch our sight. Born on June 6, 1961, Robert Podgurski.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks everybody for showing up today for the launch of Wandering on Course. Before I start, just going to mention, did you mention David Landry, is a mutual friend of ours. I met David last year up at the Cloudburst Symposium in Naples, New York. And it's a small get-together of poets, and they do a really good job. It's really isolated in the Finger Lakes region. And Brian had told me, David told me about Brian's store, and I never would have known about this.
Right.
And I live in the Charlotte area where all we believe in is tearing down bookstores and putting up more banks. So this is a godsend. This is a breath of fresh air having this store up here. And initially David mentioned to me, we need to get a hold of Brian to help figure out a name for the store. Did he tell you that?
No.
And he blew me off. I had, it was like Scuppernong. I was like, this is the South, muscadines, Or I was thinking, Ross and I, my good friend, were thinking, how about Mad Dogs? And then it came to me, Night Train.
Night Train.
All aboard the Night Train. You could have a Charles Bukowski night in the alley,
Yeah.
BYOB, bring your own box of wine, your own box to live in, whatever. And I had to throw that in because otherwise I would not have known. And this book, the cover, much of what I've written about it has come about from being in North Carolina. Many of these poems span a good 20, 25 years. We're talking about a manuscript like this, gone down to that, because I never felt comfortable overall with it until I had found the direction that I wanted to take, the direction that seemed to be underlying the text. And so on the covers, there's a tree that I had seen up on the Mountain Seas Trail, the Art Lode Trail. If anybody's familiar or ever hiked it up in Pisgah. And it was right when an ice snowstorm hit last year, so I took this picture right when I was about to get stranded in the snow. And I've actually made a study, a photographic study, which I'm going to do some work with and put online, of exposed roots of fallen trees. I'm surprised nobody's ever done that. There's some just amazing things that you see in these trees that have been uprooted from windstorms and such. But this book, in a lot of ways, is about my exposed roots and exposing my roots. And before I start, I wanted to mention a little bit from Joe Napora, author of Sentences and Bills 1917. It's a wonderful book. It's about the workers of the world, the Wobblies, the unions, during right around World War I. Some excellent stuff in there. And thinking of Pete Seeger just passing away, Pete Seeger would have loved this book. But Joe is working on a manuscript which he asked me to look at some, and it's the Mound book, and it's about a walking tour of the Indian mounds in Ohio. And it's a wonderful book. I hope he finds a good outlet for it, because it needed to be done. And his book really is, it's really like the Patterson of the mounds. And in it, he's got this one brilliant line where he talks about poets do readings to convince themselves they are real, and they write poems to convince themselves that they will abide. And when I read that, I thought to myself, you know, I've got to think about why am I doing a reading? To sell books? Well, not really. I mean, it's nice to sell books. But as I thought about that, yes, it is to feel real, but it's also to activate the chant, to inform and extend the content of the book, because otherwise, what's the point? Why not just read it yourself? Or why not I just stand here and read off the page, and that's that? I don't think we get much from that in readings. But he goes on to say that neither is so, but both. Poetry resides in the middle, and I think that's a key statement, both living and dead, spoken and written, oral and visual. The middle is the expression of the body, the unseen body. Poetry exists at that point, in between what is observed and what is imagined. And I would like to add to that, to me, that the magic of poetry, it occurs in between the phanopia, the melopia, and the logopia, as Pound put it, in between the image-casting power of words, the hypnotic sound of language, and the ratiocinative loop, the circle, created by the logic and play of the meaning of the words. And so as Brian mentioned, poetry and magic is important to me. The incantation is a purposeful oral act, whether it's for personal development, affirmations, enlightenment. I think we all have a basic idea of what most people engage in within a magical act. And poetry is not necessarily of that, but it is of necessity. To me, poetry is a translation of the greater act, a transmission picked up from encountering things, interpreting them, feeling that chant, and then projecting it outward. Hence, both these books, this book of poetry and the Sacred Alignments and Dark Side of Sigils, are sort of brother books because they came out at the same time. The Sacred Alignments basically deals with the divine signature as it emerges through the reticulations of geomagnetism, the Earth's grid, implications of Renaissance-based Enochian angelic magic that John Dee and Sir Edward Kelly came up, and modern sigil magic, which for a very brief encapsulation is very much like the Eastern yantras and mandalas, mystical images that are used for purposes of elevating consciousness, etc. But to me, the interesting thing about poetry is that poetry need not be directed. Poetry should take on a life of its own, and it should capture and possess the person in charge of translating what they're seeing around them. And possibly more liberating, an act of freedom, which is, as we all know, quite a handful. Everybody wants freedom, but people really want to exercise it. And so, with that lengthy introduction, I'll launch into the book initially here with a few poems that deal with my walking about, because walking is important to me, hiking, encountering things as I go along here, and within the state, within my surroundings. And the first poem, let's see here, is, and I was originally going to read off of some other manuscripts and things left out of the book, but I think I'm going to just stick with the book. The first piece, Fall in Love with the Brave. This is sort of a bestiary, sort of a dark bestiary that starts in my backyard, and then it moves up here. I don't know how many of you have been over to Moore's Wall, over here by Winston-Salem. I think they call it Table Rock as well. Nice climbing area. I used to climb a lot back then. I don't so much now, but these are things I encountered on the way. Fall in love with the brave. Collapsed bluebird house, mournful instinct, ensures the parents' non-return to the young dying as they must. Upsets me far more greatly than I could have guessed, the home I erected fallen, now their grave. At the escarpment summit, a snarling hellhound greeted and prevented our descent, strange, ironic, only to depart after its most vicious display. And the perfectly desiccated possum's corpse, fur, brown from decay, highlights white exposed ribs, opened cage, having long ago let loose its life, and the peregrine falcon chasing off the turkey buzzard, south, something about hell, I thought, and stars a conflict, or just a dance changing places. So I listened to the silent connections without a sound, absorbing as much as possible, point toward dark nested hopes, infinity, ever an expanding haven. Now, the bluebirds didn't die, so I did commit a falsehood. Actually, I was amazed that the bluebird house, I watched it fall open, the babies hit the ground. I was like, shit, I ran out, I grabbed them, stuffed them back in, hammered it up, and I thought, well, it's worth a shot. And Mom came back. I was sort of surprised. I didn't think she would. So there was a good ending to that story, but I guess I'm allowed to do that. What did Sidney say about in his defense of poetry? Poets do not commit falsehoods because they don't make assertions. So that lets me off the hook. This next piece, Poems of Beechnut as a Food, I'm sort of working off of Lauren's I Really Like the Woods Within. Lauren understands the importance of beech trees, and beech trees are critical. Actually, I learned from a master arborist, if you're lucky enough to have beech trees on your property, that is a sign that you have excellent soil and growing conditions. They're really picky trees. I have a giant one in my backyard right now, and they seem to have followed me as I followed them. Where I grew up in Greensboro, Pennsylvania, right outside of town, there's Bushy Run Battlefield, where the Battle of Flour Bag Hill took place. And that's basically where Bouquet's troops beat off Pontiac's Indians that he had sent. They got word that he was on his way to Fort Pitt. They sent out sentries. They engaged in battle. And it was one of these minor skirmishes that actually echoed throughout frontier areas because it basically let the settlers know we can actually beat the Indians off. But I remember seeing beechnut trees there at a very early age, picking them up, the beech nuts, chewing on them, being sorely disappointed that they did not taste like beechnut gum. And I tried and tried again. I figured one day I'll get one that actually tastes like that. Didn't work. And this poem was actually first published by Stephen Ellis in his That Broadside series in Jordan. So the Jordanians actually got to look at this poem, which I would have liked to know what their reaction is, because I don't think there is a beechnut within 1,000 miles of anywhere in Jordan. Poems of beechnut as a food. Bands of softened solar glow cut silk swift, rustling and twisting through trees. The wind took on an appearance of a strange bird race, close to being reptilian in feel, but not looks. Wisps, the nephews of gusts, crept in between the boards of our study to form the long, slender lines and russet orange swirl that led to the eagle-like head, imparting only to me a sense that death had not come, even though it felt that way. That there is pain in the field where the brush reeds and hedgerows have been cropped, sheared down, yielding enmity and growing energy, where previously red-winged blackbirds could perch and run sentries, taking no further, cut off the haven and the potential to metaphor, for we cannot gather the plants, transformed to violence by the harvest. Technique, i.e. rendered usable. In other words, let the clearing come back and the rushes lay upon our mind for a fitting crown, the hat that is a hut, radiant compost heat. Beechnut, the eternal try-not pods, I remember picking up from the grounds of Bushy Run Battlefield in my youngest years, also Blevins' stepping stone into the court of the half-kings, Gaiasuta and Gaustrax. Resembles star any scent a much more subtle aromatic flavor. 4 wooden petals expand as they dry, blossom to expose 2 triform seeds, 6 and 4 lotus power, nut as meat, but as Green's Friar Bacon admonished, to let thee see how scholars used to feed